In this video, I'm gonna show you how to produce cinematic pop music. We're talking Tommee, Profitt, Ruel, Flurry, all the big people that you hear in big movie trailers making beautiful songs that also sound cinematic. And what's better is I'm gonna be showing you an actual song that has already been produced and breaking it down step by step. And it's not just some random cinematic pop track. This is a song that's actually made over $15,000 in placements over the past year. So this is a great example of something that is not just cinematic pop, but is also performing quite well when it comes to sync placements. So first things first, let's actually take a look at what the track looks like that we are working with. This is the actual session. So as you can see, fair bit of stuff going on here. It's a little under 100 tracks total, but that is including, as you can see, a lot of vocal stacks. So that is pretty fun. I'm gonna show you just a very quick snippet of how this sounds, and then we'll break it down.
The story's just begun.
Okay, so obviously this is a really big epic, but it's also really beautiful. It's meant to be majestic and kind of one of those things that you would expect to hear in obviously something that's a little bit more on the romance side, you know, wedding films and that kind of a thing. We need to talk about why this thing sounds cinematic in the first place and what things you can do if you're working on music and you want it to sound cinematic. How can you make a pop song also feel cinematic? And that's what I want to talk about in this video. Now, one of the very first things that we do need to acknowledge when we talk about cinematic pop music is that cinematic pop music is actually very challenging to produce. It is not like every single genre is equal in difficulty level. And when we talk about difficulty level of producing, I would actually put cinematic pop music on the higher level of difficulty. That's not to sit here and say, look at me, I'm so awesome because I produce hard music. It's just acknowledging the fact that cinematic music is more challenging to produce because the orchestral elements of what makes it feel cinematic, which is typically strings. So if you want something to sound cinematic, you're probably going to need to use strings, and in some cases, a lot of strings. What you can see here, all of these brown tracks are strings. And you might be wondering, Nathan, why on earth are there so many tracks of strings? If you're talking to guys like Tommee, Profitt, or myself, or really anyone who works in cinematic music, and yes, I know this because Tommee and I talk about it quite a bit, is that you're going to layer your strings to make them not sound like a single sound library. If you're producing cinematic music, the number one challenge you're gonna run into is that if you're using a sound library for strings, almost every single sound library you're gonna use has a very specific sound to it. So if you're using the native instrument symphony strings or Berlin strings or the anthology strings or any number of different strings, they're all gonna have a sound to them, which anyone who produces cinematic music is gonna be able to very quickly be like, oh, I bet you're using Stradivari cello for that. That's why it sounds that way. And you don't typically want that. The idea here is that we wanna create it so it sounds like this is a real orchestra. That's the whole point. And so if you want to be able to accomplish that, you are going to need to layer lots of different elements together to make it feel that way. So for example, let's take just this one melody. So this is using the chamber strings. Now what you need to understand here is that if you want to have a really strong melody like that, you're typically going to do it in octaves. It's going to make it stand out a little bit more. So we've got these 2 octaves. Now that sounds nice, but here's another example of legato strings that we layered in. Right? And then we have another one down the octaves. So we actually have 3 octaves of this melody happening. And we're using different sound libraries to add sonic complexity. So this is tip number 1 when it comes to producing string libraries. If you want to make your string libraries sound big, if you want to sound expressive and dynamic and unique, where you're not going to be able to say, oh, I bet you totally use Berlin strings for that. Typically, you don't want that in my opinion. So the way you're going to accomplish that is by layering your strings together. Now, this does raise one big issue, which means you need to have kind of a lot of sound libraries. And this is one of the other problems with cinematic pop music is it's also an expensive genre to get into because you probably need to own a lot of different sound libraries to get this done. I own several $1,000s worth of sound libraries, and unfortunately, that is just the reality of how it's done. So if we look at this entire track, you will see there are strings almost entirely throughout. I'm using these chamber evolution strings here at times. Giving this swelling.
We can be, just wait and see. The future is bright.
So what I want to do is actually show you how this sounds if we take some of these cinematic elements out of the song, and all of a sudden it just starts to sound kind of like a pop song, which is why it is cinematic pop. Because typically you're gonna have very pop produced vocals, the melody, the lyrics, oftentimes the song structure itself is gonna be very much in the vein of pop music. It's just how you go about the production of it is going to change the context of how we hear it. So if we take all of this orchestral stuff out, this is what it sounds like if we were to start right on the verse.
Let's find a place where we can get away. Just spend a day.
And actually, this sounds quite nice, but it does not sound truly cinematic. Now, the felty piano and some of the keyboard elements that I'm using with this kind of give you a little bit of cinematic flavor to it, but I wouldn't be sitting here saying, oh, that's totally cinematic pop. Now we listen to it with all the string elements and orchestral stuff.
Let's find a place where we can get away. Just spend a day. Dream a dream with me. There's so much.
It's these little moments here that let you know, no, this is kind of cinematic. We're gonna do some things in here that's different than just your standard pop music. And then if we skip ahead to the very first chorus, it's gonna sound like this.
The story's just begun. The story's just begun.
That brings us to the next aspect of what makes something sound cinematic in the context of cinematic pop, and that would be drums, percussion. And you might have noticed it just with what I just played. Listen again to this first chorus.
The story's just begun.
Okay, so what is it about this that we hear as cinematic? Well, the way we hear this as cinematic is it's not a kick, hi-hat, snare, toms, and just like, a ride cymbal or other things like that. And it's not a drum set, right? So typically pop music is going to have, your standard kick, snare, hi-hats, maybe some toms for some fills. You might have a loop in there, some toppers in there that kind of add some extra rhythm. Sometimes you'll hear like tambourines and shakers and things like that, depending on what style of pop music you're creating. In this context, we don't get any of that. The other way we could do pop is, let's say this was like indie pop, then it'd probably be a drum set, right? Like a really dead, fat kind of drum set that we would hear. This is completely different. If we listen to this with just the drums right here, just with that alone, the average person's gonna say, that kind of sounds like a movie trailer. This sounds cinematic, right? Well, what about this sounds cinematic? And typically it's gonna be the big floor toms or the big trailer hits using specific libraries that are orchestral in nature when it comes to the percussion. Now, you don't have to necessarily exclusively use orchestral libraries, but typically you're going to be looking for things like Damage. Keep Forest makes a bunch of stuff. Native Instruments has a bunch of stuff. In fact, I believe the taikos in here are from the Native Instruments library. Damage is done in conjunction with Native Instruments, I believe. But if we listen to just some of these soloed out, right? It has this kind of aggressive, like cinematic element to it that makes you think this sounds like a movie trailer. Taikos are probably one of the top 3 most used percussion elements if you want to have some cinematic drums. This is what that sounds like. Right? The other thing is cymbal swells or suspended cymbals or riser elements, things that are going to help give you some of this shoo, push and pull, which is why I have multiple cymbal swells throughout, and a lot of times just a little bit of a trick that you can use if you're using a lot of cymbal swells is to have multiple different cymbal swells, but then pitch them differently so they don't just sound identical to each other. And so let's just break down what's in here. We have all of these elements in here that are kind of secondary, but they are still creating the cinematic feeling. I would call these like your higher frequency percussion, like the woods and plastics, and maybe like some of the ethnic drums that we'll get into a little bit later. But then on the bottom end, I use booms a lot. And so if you add all of this together, it's gonna sound very, very cinematic. You got cymbal swells, you got low end booms, right? And you got the things kind of in the low mid range, which would be your taikos, your toms, your plastic hits, maybe some ethnic drums. And a lot of times what I use on styles like this is I will use pre-created patterns. Damage has some amazing things. Tommee Profitt actually has his new drum library, which I use quite frequently. One of the only drum libraries that I know of that also has 6/8 patterns, which is really, really helpful. But then I'm still doing things in the context of the track that you would still hear in modern pop music. And this is also what makes it cinematic pop. You need to still be incorporating things that you would hear in modern pop. One example of this is stuff like sub bass.
Look in your eyes, know everything.
And also, whenever we have this second verse happening, I'm just going to play a little bit of this. The percussion also, this is very much what I would do on a pop track that was in this style that was not even meant to be cinematic. I'm going to be blending all these elements together where I'm using some stuff that's cinematic, some stuff that's getting pulled from pop music, and I'm merging them all together. And we're kind of creating like a melting pot of styles. So let me just play a little bit of this and we'll break it down.
Just one look in your eyes, I know everything will be alright. The future
we
is
go.
bright. Hold on tight.
So what's really cool about this is the percussion is actually doing stuff that you would find in a lot of modern pop. Very filtered out kind of topper-esque percussions, you know, little perks here and there that are creating this rhythm, things that are filtered out, maybe a little bit of reverb and delay on them. Let me just play a little bit of this solo out percussion. This is something that would not be particularly uncommon to hear within the context of pop music. And then guess what we do here? We also throw a 4 on the floor with a filtered kick. And then on top of that, we're adding this right here. Let me just play a solo out. Right, and this is kind of creating this boom, and you put that against a 4 on the floor. Everything else we've got. That's actually something that I would do in a pop song, actually. Regardless of whether it's cinematic or not, this is something that you would find in pop songs pretty commonly. But then we are oftentimes doing things that sound very pop, and then we will just kind of just transition, be like, okay, now we're going full cinematic here. And sometimes it's a blend of all the above. What makes this particular section feel cinematic is, again, it's actually the strings. So if we were to pull out the strings, take those out, and then just have everything else going. Now, obviously, if this was a pop song, you'd probably have a little bit more happening in the mid-range here. This does feel quite empty. But when we put these strings in, again, this is what's actually really selling the idea that this is a cinematic pop track. And just for the sake of helping you understand what's going on in the strings, let me just solo these strings for you so you can hear. So there's a combination of things happening. We have some just pad-like strings going on, but we've also kind of got a little bit of a counter melody happening that's going with the vocals in some of these solo strings, which sound a lot more raw, a little bit more exposed. But we're blending that all together to create, again, a unique texture. But if we just listen to everything that's going on the top here that is, we'll say, a little bit more pop-inspired, it's gonna sound more like this. Right, and then we got this little bit of a pulsing element going on here. And again, all this is very much pop inspired. The other thing I would say is that the use of reverb on the vocals in particular is another aspect that you'll find very commonly within this subgenre of cinematic pop music, which is a little bit more of that kind of ethereal, majestic, beautiful cinematic pop. So obviously you've got like epic cinematic pop, which would be like really dark pop inspired or like alt pop mixed with some cinematic stuff. You know, I did a song called No Stranger to the Dark. Very, very heavy, just dark, gritty, punchy, versus the more like beautiful side of cinematic pop, which would be this specifically, where we're gonna be using very long, very large hall reverbs on the vocals in particular, using some like moody vocals. You can obviously tell here what's going on in the vocals.
The future is bright.
You know, so Rin did these, really beautiful aspects. This is with the artist Moonwater that I did the song with. But you'll find lots of things that we did vocally that are just really cool, like accents to what's going on, where the vocals now are almost a part of the instrumental. That's done in pop music, but it's definitely done at a higher level or more common in this subgenre of cinematic pop music. And like a lot of other pop music, the vocal production is going to be very similar, where you have big layers, lots and lots and lots and lots of vocals. Like, look at how many layers of vocals we have going on here when she sings this chorus.
Story's just begun. The story's just begun.
You know, we've got like 3-part harmony going on. We've got a lot of stuff going on. We've got multiple layers of everything that she is singing. And this is very much pulled from the context of pop music as well. And then finally, later on in the song, we did add some brass. This is one of those things where this is more what I would call secondary. Brass within the context of cinematic music is definitely normal, but I would also say utilizing brass in cinematic pop music is not a requirement unless you're doing very, very epic stuff, in which case you're probably going to be using very big low brass like Brahms, epic hits, those types of things. You'll find brass a lot more commonly, but in this subgenre of more of this beautiful cinematic pop music, you're not going to find brass quite as frequently, but I did utilize it here at the end. Let me just play the whole ending here for you, and then I'll solo out the brass. So I went ahead and muted these vocals, but here's what the brass sounds like initially before we add the French horn in. So this is using mostly trombones. And then we add this French horn melody on top. So it's this very stately, majestic element that we've got going on. And really when you blend this with the strings, it does work very, very well. And it sounds quite beautiful, especially when we add the French horn. I'll just start there. It makes it feel big and rich, and it does add this kind of sweeping character to the song as a whole. But I would say that using brass like this is one of those things that you certainly don't have to do. And in some cases, brass can actually work against you unless you really understand how to make it sound good. And so even now, looking at this production, this is a production I did probably 2 years ago. I approach brass differently now than I did at the time that I produced this. And so when I listen to this now, I'm like, oh, I kind of wish it would have sounded a little bit different. And a big reason for that is because when I'm producing with brass music now, I'm very particular about mic placement within the sound libraries themselves. This is actually a pretty unique topic to discuss specifically when we talk about mic positions, but what you'll notice within the world of cinematic sound libraries is that a lot of these libraries have varied mic positions that you can choose from. And I'm just going to show you what I'm talking about. So what I want to show you is how this looks in the context of the native instruments libraries. If we're using brass, for example, that melodic element in the French horn, the da 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 is a legato patch. And if you're doing any sort of melody, you need to make sure that you actually use the legato patch. If you just go grab horns, it's not going to sound good because you're not going to get the natural slurring between the notes, which means it's just not going to sound as great. So you need to make sure that you use legato. And this is the same for strings as well. If you're using string libraries, you need to make sure you use legato patches if you have things that are happening that are melodic. Okay, so the part goes like this. Right? But what's going to sound way better is if we go into the mixer. And by the way, every sound library is going to look a little bit different. And most of the time, if you're going to have mic placements like this, these are on the more expensive libraries. So if you're using free libraries or cheap libraries, you're probably not going to have this. And I know that that sucks to say, but It's just true. What you'll find is that these libraries are essentially creating a mix for you. And that can work if you don't care too much about it. But for me, I want something specific. I want it to sound rich. I want it to sound big. I want it to sound nice. So what I have found for the best settings for what I do, you can just literally copy these settings if you want, is I turn on the close and mid mics and I turn off this stereo mix. I don't really like how the stereo mix sounds. The other thing I'm gonna do is turn on the compressor down here. And what I have found is that if you set it to somewhere right in here, what would that be, like 3 o'clock? 12, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 3 o'clock. You're gonna get a nice bit of compression. Sounds so much better. Like if we just go back to the original, just turn those off, go back to the stereo, listen to this. Right? And let's turn that back on, go back, turn the compressor on, and now listen. To me, that is such a better sound. And what you'll find within cinematic pop music is that a lot of these types of decisions are incredibly nuanced decisions. And if you make 100 really good nuanced decisions that seem small, they compound on top of each other to make something sound fantastic. So if you're working on making cinematic pop music, I really hope this video helped you, and you should check out this video right here if you want to see how I actually produce a song completely from start to finish. I go through the entire process. It's awesome. Just click right here. See you there.